Hi everyone, I'm Samantha, and today we're going to talk about how to make sense of food labels. What I hope by the end of this session is that you feel a lot more confident interpreting food labels and making sense of them when you're in the grocery store, shopping, and comparing. So we're going to use our first example, which is this little guy here, which is a box of cereal. And at first glance, it seems promising. We see shredded wheat. This is a trusted brand. This is something we know is typically really healthy. But we also see here it's a dark chocolate flavored shredded wheat, which is a little different than the usual. Dark chocolate does have some heart-healthy properties, which is why it might be considered potentially not a terrible choice. So what the idea behind today's session is that by the end, we can be able to look at the label on here and determine if this is meeting criteria that are going to give us an aim for a healthy heart. And so that's what we're going to, so we'll come back to this a little bit later on. So how can we be sure? We're going to check the label, but we'll get through there together and go through some examples first. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about different parts of the label. So nutrition facts table is a big one. And before 2005, the food labels were not mandatory, so they were voluntary. They were on different parts of the packaging. They were in different sizes, different colors, sometimes hard to find. So there was no consistency. But after December 2005, things changed and the labels became standardized. And this was really important because it meant that the labels were bigger, easier to read, easier to find, and on more foods than ever before. And then after 2016, we also see that we have another update to our food labels, which food manufacturers have until 2022 to fully adopt. And so that's what we're going to look for. We see a few little changes from our current labels to where we're going to get to in a little while. And we'll see that certain components of the food labels are being changed. So the calories are going to be bigger and bolder and easier to read. They're putting the three main macronutrients together. So that's fat, protein, and carbohydrates. So those will be right underneath the words calories, because those are what contribute to calories in the diet. So that's what we're looking at. We're also going to see amounts change for minerals. We're going to see changes in sugar content, right? So we're going to have more availability of how to gauge if that's a high sugar containing food or not. So these are all pretty exciting changes. They haven't been all rolled out yet, but they're coming soon. So the first thing we want to talk about are those nutrition facts tables. Those nutrition facts tables are helping you compare different foods, right? Maybe you're on a specific diet and you need to look for more of a specific nutrient. And so those nutrition facts tables are there to help you do that. So those are those big white rectangles that you're going to see on different packages. The other thing that we recognize is that it's not realistic to have nutrition facts tables on all foods, so there are some exceptions. So some exceptions include fresh fruit and vegetables, right? Although I did see a pineapple with a label on it once, but that's not usual. Anything that's raw meat, raw poultry, seafood, and fish that you buy in the store. But if it comes in from outside in a different package, it does have a label. But if it's prepared in store, it doesn't have to. So that it also applies to bakery goods. If they make their own sausages or salads and so on, they don't have to have a label. But if they're brought in from another food manufacturer outside of the store, then it will have to have a nutrition facts table. And then foods that also have very few nutrients. So we're talking about things like tea and coffee, herbs and spices, things like that don't have to have nutrition facts table. And the last one, which is probably a little bit more contentious, would be alcoholic beverages. Alcoholic beverages don't have to tell you how many calories are in it. Some people believe they should. They don't currently. Would that change if you drank any more or less? That's your choice, but certainly at the moment we don't have nutrition facts tables on alcoholic beverages. All right, so the nutrition facts table has different components to it. The first thing I want you to look at is underneath the words nutrition facts, you'll see a serving size. That serving size is written in a bunch of different ways. So we have it in common measures like cups, or bowls or number of crackers, for example, but then also because Canada is metric, you'll also see it in milliliters or grams or things like that. So the idea there is that it's not a suggested serving for you. They're using standard reference ranges so that whenever you pick up cereal boxes, that it's a similar serving size so it's easy to compare. And that's the whole idea. It's hard to pick up a bread and look at one slice is 50 grams and another bread is 90 grams. It's really hard to compare those breads. So they have a kind of range, so it makes it easier for us to compare different foods. So that's what we have them. So again, not a suggested quantity for you to consume, but it's certainly something that makes it a little easier for you to make more informed decisions about whether that's a good food choice for you. Now this is an interesting one, and this is where serving sizes are interesting. So perhaps on a box of cereal, you might see the serving size as being a 1 cup serving, which is going to be about equivalent to this size, or about the size of your closed fist. That's about 1 cup. But if your cereal bowl is much bigger than this, perhaps the serving size isn't going to match up with what you would normally eat. Maybe it's an amount that makes you feel full and satisfied. So if you eat maybe 2 of these, then it's going to look a little different. So then you would look at that label differently and be able to maybe make a few just quick calculations to determine how much fiber are you actually getting or how much sodium are you now getting. So you would double the numbers to make it more accurate and more align with how much you would normally eat. And that's what we want to look at that. So it's going to give you a truer picture of what you're eating. The next thing we're going to do now is we're going to look at that percent daily value. So if you look at that nutrition facts table on the very right-hand side column, you'll see all these little percentages. Honestly, this is what trips most people up about labels. This is something that's maybe not as intuitive to look at and determine whether something is good or not. What are these percentages used for? Good question. So what we want to know about it is it's a way to gauge if you're getting a lot or a little of something in that particular nutrient in that serving of food. Okay, that's a lot to take in. So the idea is that it's benchmarking or gauging for you how much of that nutrient you're going to get. So it's based on the recommendations for about a 2,000 calorie diet. So I know I don't teach people about calorie levels, but the idea behind it is that for the majority of the population, it's going to give us a rough idea about roughly how much fiber we recommend for that, or how much sodium and so on. And so what it's going to say is, say you see a grams of sodium or fiber, it's going to tell you, put that into context for you, right? How much that's actually looking like. So it's just giving you a benchmark. That's all it is. So nothing to be worried about with that percent. Okay, say we want to use it to gauge if you're getting enough of something, like for example, fiber, which is a wonderful example. On a cereal box, what we want to do is you want to look at that serving size first, compare it to what you're going to eat, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go down the list, we're going to look at that fiber content, and we're going to look at that percent daily value. If that percent daily value is at about 15% or higher per serving, you're getting a good amount of fiber for that amount of food, and that's what it's telling you. So if it's a little bit lower than that, you maybe just want to gauge, see if there's another option out there that's going to give you a little bit more fiber. So 15% is the key there. You can also use that for different minerals as well, like calcium and other things. So those minerals will be at the bottom of the nutrition facts table, and they'll have a percent daily value as well. Now, say you want to look at something where you want less of something. So perhaps you want maybe less sodium in your diet, or maybe less saturated fat or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a slightly different number. We're going to aim for about 5 to 10% or less for something like sodium. So similarly, we're going to look at maybe a different food package. We've got crackers here, and we're going to look at how many crackers and then how much sodium is in there. Sometimes when you see the milligrams of sodium, a lot of people might think that any amount of sodium is too high. What we want to do is say, well, let's put that into context, use that percent daily value, and it'll give us a better idea of whether it's too high or whether it's in a good zone for us, so that we don't get too much sodium in our diet, okay? And that's what we're looking at for those percent daily values. Say you want to compare two different items. This is something I often show when I do this workshop to patients, is that if you had an example of two different cereals, this is a great slide to look at. So we have cereal 1 and we have cereal 2, and I've highlighted a few areas that I want you to look at. And what I want you to do is determine, based on what we've now learned up to now, to see which of these cereals might be considered a healthier choice. So for cereal 1, you'll see that the fiber is 1 gram, and that's about 4% of your fiber for the day. So what we just learned in the previous couple of slides was that fiber should be around 15%. So we can determine that this cereal is a little bit low in fiber. If we look at cereal number 2, the fiber amount is 5 grams. This is about 20% of your fiber for the day, and that's a much better amount of fiber per serving for this cereal. So cereal number 2 already looks a little bit better. Now maybe some of you have caught something a little sneaky, and that's that serving size looks different for cereal 1 and cereal 2. Cereal 1 shows at 1 1/4 cups of a serving, and cereal 2 shows at 3/4 a cup of cereal. So they do look different, and we just talked about serving sizes needing to be the same. But I want you to look at the grams next. So the weight of both cereals are the same at 30 grams. So maybe what the volume is different. So maybe one is more like a puffed rice or puffed wheat, which takes up more volume in a bowl. But then the other cereal might be more like a muesli or granola, which is more dense. It takes up less volume, but the weights are the same. So we can still use those examples because the weights are the same, and that's how we can still compare it. So at the end, we recognize cereal 2 has a lot more going for it health-wise. So the sodium is lower, the fiber is higher, and overall looks like a pretty good choice. Okay? Let's talk now about sodium when using a couple of different strategies. So we've talked about the first strategy, which is using the percent daily value, right? The percent daily value for sodium is about 5 to 10% or less. And when we look at labels, if we see that amount, that we know we're in a good zone. This is a really interesting example. So this picture that you see of this label is showing you that for a cup of prepared of this particular food, the sodium is 590 milligrams, or 27% of your sodium for the day prepared. We're aiming for 5 to 10% or less, so 27% seems awfully high, doesn't it? The other thing that a lot of people like is a slightly different strategy to look at sodium, and that's using traffic light colors instead. Traffic light colors with strategy number 2 on this slide, a lot of people really like because it's easy to identify. So this is the very same food label before. I've just cropped it a little bit, but you'll see for 1 cup, it's still 590 milligrams. So how do we determine, just based on the milligrams, if this is too high or too low? Well, if we use this traffic light color system, we see that if it's 0 to 200 milligrams of sodium per serving, you're in the green light. So that means go ahead, this is not too high in sodium for you for that serving of food, no problem. And then we move up to the yellow zone, which is caution or watch out. And this is where we would say 200 to 400 milligrams per serving would be yellow. The very top is too much, red light. So anything over 400 milligrams of sodium per serving is considered too high. We want to maybe rethink it. That doesn't mean every single food item you buy in your whole life has to be less than 400 milligrams, but the majority of the time we want to be making some of those choices. Occasionally we're going to have maybe some treats here and there. That's not a problem, but more of the time we want to be looking for some of those healthier options, right? So that's where this traffic light color idea can be a really handy strategy for some people. So pick the strategy that works best for you, whether you like the percent daily value or whether you like the traffic light colors. Both of them work really well. Now, are you interested in seeing what that food was? Well, the food, interestingly, is a hamburger helper package that you might see in the grocery store. What's interesting about this, if you look at the very top of the package, is that it has a really bright blue ribbon across the top of the box, and it says 25% less sodium. This is interesting because a lot of people might have seen this on the store shelf and think, well, of course I want less sodium. So you might have picked it up, perhaps not looking at a nutrition facts table to double check. What we now see is even with 25% less sodium, it's still considered a very high sodium containing food. So we want to be really mindful of that. So can you imagine the regular version of that same product is going to be rather high in sodium as well. So something to consider when we're looking at some of the front of packaging features. The next thing we want to talk about, and we're not going to talk about it a whole lot, but is the idea of ingredient lists. You know, when we go to the grocery store, we spend enough time looking at the nutrition facts table and comparing that it doesn't make sense that we spend hours and hours looking at ingredient lists as well. But ingredient lists can be handy for certain foods and for certain people because the way ingredients are listed they're listed in descending order. So that means the first ingredient is found in the biggest amount in that food. So for something like a bread, if the first ingredient is whole grain whole wheat flour, you can feel pretty confident that there's going to be more whole wheat flour in that bread than perhaps, you know, refined white flour, which is important when you're looking for higher fiber options in your diet. Now, the other thing we also know is that they're doing some updates to our ingredient list as well. And so because the ingredients are listed by weight, they can be handy. So if the first ingredient on the list is a sugar or a collection of sugars in this example, well, we know that there's going to be more sugar in this food than any other ingredient, even though it might have really healthy ingredients in it, like oats or nuts or dried fruit or things like that. So we want to be really mindful of what kind of ingredients you see near the beginning of the list. Now, what they're doing now is they're going to be grouping the sugars together. So they're going to be easier to identify because they don't always list sugars as sugar. It might be listed as molasses or cane syrup or things like that. And so we want to be able to help consumers identify those more easily. And so that's going to be one of the changes. And they're going to try to use more common names. I think some people feel a bit overwhelmed by looking at some of the complex names that they use, perhaps for additives or different ingredients that are completely safe to consume. So using more common names makes it a little bit more accessible for most people if you're looking at them. So that's a little tip for you when you're looking at ingredient lists. The next thing we're going to talk about are nutrition claims. Nutrition claims come in different forms, but we know that these are ways that we can make more informed decisions when we're choosing food items in the grocery store. Now, the first thing we have is we have to recognize these are very regulated statements. So you just can't put anything you want on your label. These are regulated by Health Canada, and so food manufacturers have to show Health Canada that these foods meet certain criteria in order to get these claims used on their labels. So not everything you'll see will have a claim on it. So if you see 2 cans on there and they both say they're a good source of vitamin C, it doesn't mean that the can that doesn't have that claim isn't also high in vitamin C because they're optional statements. They're not mandatory. So something to keep in mind if you see those. But let's look at a few examples. So we have examples of nutrition claims where things might be listed as free, low, reduced, and light. And free usually means there's very little to no amount of that nutrient. So you might see something listed as sodium free, for example. Low, you might see something listed as low in calories or low in fat. And so those are things where there's going to be a small amount of that nutrient in the food, but not a very large amount. And then reduced and light, these are a little bit more complicated because they're a little bit more vague. And so we're going to dive into that. So reduced means that food has to have at least 25% less fat or calories in it than the regular version of that food. So as we saw in a previous example with the hamburger helper, just because it's reduced in sodium doesn't mean it's going to meet the criteria for you and for what we're aiming for. So something to keep in mind. And then light is also kind of tricky. It means that these foods are light, lower in calories or lower in fat. But again, it's a little bit more vague, and I'll show you an example of that as well. This is a picture of an olive oil. Maybe you've seen this in the grocery store, but I want you to look at the label really carefully because what you can see on here is the label says extra light, but the olive oil isn't actually light in calories or fat. So if we look at the print even more closely, you'll see in very small print, it reads extra light tasting olive oil. So this really just means it's not the very first pressing of the olives which is really green, it's fruity, it has a lot of nutrition, but it has a lot more flavor. So by the end, when the olives are pretty well pressed out, they'll take the rest of it. And for people who don't like really flavorful olive oil or want to cook with it with a little higher heat, you might want a milder tasting oil, which this would be a good option for. But a lot of people have told me they bought it because they thought it was lower in fat. But oil is fat and fat is oil, and so you can't really take it out. So just to be aware of some of those things out there. Now, say you want more of a nutrient. So say you want more fiber. So you might see something listed as a source of fiber or a good source or an excellent source. You might see it listed as high or very high. And these are just different examples, just showing you where you would get more of these nutrients. And here's a good example of a breakfast cereal where it's listed as very high fiber cereal. And this is something that's just highlighting a feature of this food. But again, I still want you to flip over that box, look at the side and look at that nutrition facts table and say, is this the amount of fiber I'm looking for that suits me, right? And that's important to look at. The last type of claim we're going to look at are health claims. There are different types. They're slightly less common than those nutrition claims, but we do see some. One is called a disease risk reduction claim, bit of a mouthful. But what it's telling us is it's giving us a little bit more information about maybe a specific nutrient in that food that's been shown in the scientific evidence to help lower risk for certain diseases that might be relevant to you. So an example here is a healthy diet rich in a variety of vegetables and fruit may help reduce the risk of heart disease. And so this is something that would be very relevant to our cardiac rehab patients or anyone who's potentially at risk for heart disease, because we recognize that when we eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, the evidence is very strong to support the fact that we see lower rates of heart disease develop. So you might see this on a label for something where there's a lot of fruits and vegetables present in it. And so that would be something you might see. Now, sometimes claims are used, but they cannot be used in this example on something like jam or marmalade. So even though jams and marmalades are typically fruit-based and there's a lot of fruit in it, because there's a large amount of sugar used in conjunction with the fruit to make that jam, we can't give it that same claim. So we can't use claims on things like that, or on fruit juices, for example, or on, say, olives, just because of the salt content or the concentrated amount of sugar in fruit juices. Even though it's made from fruit and that fruit is healthy, we recognize that eating pieces of fruit is still healthier as an option than drinking it in the form of juice. Okay, so those are just some examples. The next thing we're going to talk about are health claims related to a breakfast cereal. And I want to show you an example. This is an oatmeal breakfast cereal that's cold cereal. It's not a hot oatmeal, it's cold. And what's interesting about this is right on the label, they have a nutrition claim on the front. And you'll see it close up, it says oat fiber helps reduce cholesterol. So what Quaker has to do is they have to prove that the amount of oat fiber found in this breakfast cereal per serving has to meet a threshold in which it would have an impact on people's cholesterol. So you can't just say, we threw some oats in there, we're good. We actually have to show that the amount of oats in this breakfast cereal is sufficiently high enough that would actually have an impact on your cholesterol when you eat this over time. So this is where a health claim can be used, and where you might find it on a cereal is often very commonly found. The next thing we're going to talk about are general health claims. General health claims are typically claims that are made by non-governmental organizations and corporations, like food manufacturers, for example. And this is where you might have features that are highlighted on the front of a food, like, for example, this can of black beans. This can of black beans has different features written on the front, but that's been vetted by the corporation. So Loblaw brand has sort of done their food testing on this and found that this is a very high fiber containing food, but the way they've canned it, they've used very little sodium, so they can also say that it's no salt added as well. So this is an example of a claim that is used by corporations but is not part of Health Canada's claims, and so it's different from governmental claims. So I always say to people, don't rely solely on what you see on the front of the packaging. I always want you to sort of flip that around, look for that nutrition facts table and say, what is the fiber in this, or what is the sodium in this, and does that align with what I'm looking for? And when it does, you can sort of happily be able to say with confidence, you know, this is a good food product for me. And that's where, you know, the information that you're getting from these can be really helpful. Now, many of you may remember that the Heart and Stroke Foundation had a program called the Health Check Symbol, and that Health Check Symbol was there to help highlight maybe healthier food options when people weren't as maybe savvy or informed about that. That program ended in 2015 with the advent of more grocery store dietitians, a lot of in-store options where they provide programs to help people identify healthier options. So that's why we generally don't see that health symbol anymore. And then back to the idea, so these general health claims that you'll see on these black beans are really just highlighting that feature of the food. So that can be a really handy thing for you. So something to keep in mind when you're doing your groceries and looking at your different labels. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is Canada's Food Guide. Now, this food guide was updated in 2019. It was a really important update that we had. And so what I thought we would do is, using some of the messages from the food guide, look at some different labels associated with it, and then help you feel more comfortable interpreting it. So the first thing we're going to look at is, you'll see that half of that plate is covered with vegetables and fruit. And this is something we really encourage people to do. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfectly styled like the photo, but certainly we recognize when we eat more vegetables and more fruit in our diet, we see improvements in disease risk. We know that eating more vegetables and more fruit pieces, like the whole version of the fruit and the vegetables, are definitely healthier and higher in fiber than juices. But what we have here is we have a label for a low sodium vegetable juice. And this is interesting because we already saw that sometimes things might be labeled as low sodium but maybe aren't low enough. So what I've done here is I've got a label for you. You'll see at the very top, we're going to look at that serving size, and you'll see it's for 1 cup serving. So that's, I would say, a reasonable serving size for most people. Now, I've highlighted the percent daily value for sodium for you to look at, but then also I want you to look at, if you prefer the traffic light color one, you can also use the milligrams of sodium. So if you look at this label and you look for 1 cup serving, you're getting 120 milligrams of sodium. How do you feel about that? Now, interestingly, if you look at the percent daily value, it's at 5%. We basically say 5 to 10% or less, you're doing okay. For the milligrams, if it's less than 200 milligrams per serving, you're in the green light zone. That means it's a good choice for you. So this one kind of meets its label, which says low sodium. So it actually is low sodium, and it could be a good choice if you wanted to have some vegetable juice. The next thing we're going to look at is, we're going to talk a little bit about whole grains. Now, whole grains come in all sorts of different kinds of things. You'll see we have whole grains, like things like oats, for example, here. That's a whole grain. Or maybe you're looking for like a whole wheat kind of bran-based cereal, and so that would be another example. And then we've also got different rices. So we've got things like wild rice and brown rice, and you can get medleys where it's all mixed together. These are also whole grains. So we're encouraging people to eat more whole grains more often because they're typically a lot higher in fiber. Fiber is filling, makes you feel full. It also helps clean out your digestive system. I call it the natural portion controller because you feel more full when you eat things that are higher in fiber. So we know that more often eating these types of foods regularly is better for your body than having what we call refined grains. Refined grains are when you've taken a lot of the nutrition out of the food. So think of things that are made from primarily white flour. So white bread, white buns, croissants, danishes, cookies. A lot of those things are tasty and we don't have to stop eating them, but we just maybe be careful about how often we include those types of foods in our diet. And so when we talk about whole grain foods, maybe we want to look for higher fiber and lower sodium options. And so our example was looking at a cracker, because sometimes you just want some crackers for a snack, and that's okay. So what we have here is we have a label for this box of pita-based crackers, and we want to look to see if, based on this, how are we doing? So look at the serving size. It's about 10 crackers. Don't worry so much about the calories, but we're going to look at the sodium and we're going to look at the fiber. So you can see the fiber is about 1 gram. That's about 4% of your fiber for the day. What do you remember about that? We wanted to aim for about 15%, right, for fiber, or about 4 grams of fiber per serving. So it's a bit low in fiber. And the sodium is about 210 milligrams. Now, if you look at the percent daily value, we said less than 5 to 10%. So it's kind of right in there at 9%. And at 210, it's just a hair over the 200 milligrams, which is the green zone. So it's not too terrible from a sodium perspective. So it's about whether this is something you really enjoy having, and we can sort of balance it out and say, listen, a little bit of high fiber or low fiber versus high fiber, but the sodium's reasonable. You can kind of figure that out, or maybe you put it back on the shelf and see, is there something that has low sodium but also high fiber? So I would say it's not an absolute here. It's more about, I think, how much you're going to have, how often you're going to eat them, and that's what we want to look at with whole grains. So if you're having these every day, you know, at tea time for snacks and stuff like that, it's maybe not the best choice for an everyday snack, but for here and there, it's fine, right, in terms of sodium amount. And maybe you find other ways to include other high fiber options in your diet at other points in the day, and that'll just help back that up. Now we're going to talk about protein foods. Now protein foods are really important, and they certainly get a lot of airplay these days, where people think high protein is really important. We absolutely recognize that protein is important for a strong immune system, for wound healing, for building up muscle strength. So protein has a really important role to play. We don't need heaps of protein, however, but we do recommend that we get a serving of protein at each meal. So if you're eating sort of 3 regular meals a day, that we try to get protein at each of those times. And protein can look different for different people. It could be meat and fish and chicken and eggs, or for other people it might be more plant-based proteins like beans and lentils and nuts and seeds, or soy products and things like that. So all of those kinds of foods are really rich sources of protein. They're all equally important to include in the diet. So depending on what you include more of, if you're more omnivorous or you're more plant-based, doesn't matter. Those are both equally important ways to get protein in your diet. So one isn't better than the other, but they're different for different people, for sure. Now, what we recognize is we have a big emphasis on trying to encourage people to eat more plant-based proteins. So maybe if you're not used to having beans or lentils in your diet, finding ways to incorporate it. Maybe you're incorporating it along with something like poultry in your diet, and that's fine, right? Maybe a soup or a stew is a great, easy way to kind of try to incorporate more plant proteins in your diet, which is healthy. We also recognize that a major part of important protein, especially for heart patients, is looking at fish intake. We recognize fish intake as being a really rich, naturally occurring source of omega-3 fatty acids in the diet. So when we want to get enough of those important nutrients in the diet, particularly for our heart patients, we recommend at least 2 servings of fish per week to get that amount in. If you take a supplement, that can be helpful too, but we recognize that getting it from fish itself seems to offer some more benefits based on the research we have currently. Now, what we have here is we have a label for almonds. And so almonds we recognize as being a really healthful food. They have, I call it the trifecta of good food here, right? We've got fiber, we've got protein, and we've got fat in it, but it's not just any fat, it's really heart-healthy fat. So that's why we encourage people to include almonds in their diet. And so when you look at a label like this, and I've had more than one person say to me, when I looked at the label for almonds, I was surprised, I was shocked, I almost didn't want to buy them because the calories were so high, the fat was so high. What do I do with this? Well, you have to recognize the fat is high in almonds. In most nuts, it's going to be high. But when we're talking to people about, serving size, it works out to be about a handful. That's about a handful there, but a 1/4 cup of almonds is what we're aiming for. So that's what we would recommend for people. And you can have that every day. And the amount of fat in it is high, but we have to recognize Fat is satiating, so when we eat foods that are high in fiber and protein, it's filling. When you have something high in fiber, protein, and fat, it's going to fill you up a little bit better than if you didn't have any of those foods in it, right? And so sometimes crackers is filling, but you need to eat more of them if the fiber's low, right? And because they're not usually a good source of protein, that's where nuts and seeds can be really helpful. So when we talk about the label here, yes, we'll see that the fat content looks high and the calories look high, but I want you to look at the fiber. The fiber's high, so the fiber's at 4 grams. It's at about 11% of your fiber for the day, so that's pretty reasonable. And the sodium's at 0 because these are raw almonds. So even if they were roasted but they were unsalted, you're still going to see a pretty low sodium content on there. So I mean, we also have to recognize the protein, 6 grams, that's a really reasonable source of protein. And as long as you're having that 1/4 cup handful, you're going to sort of get not too much, but just enough of it so that you feel, you know, the benefit of it, that it tastes good, but it's going to give you that sense of fullness, which, you know, is something we ought to, you know, consider a little bit more when we're looking at some snack options. Okay, so we've finished talking about the Canada's Food Guide, a lot of the messages that we see in the Canada's Food Guide. So we come back to that shredded wheat box again. Remember this one? The dark chocolate shredded wheat. So now we can look at the label and you'll see I have the label on a slide so you can see it closely. And you'll see that when we look at the label, we could look at things like fiber and sodium and see that they're quite good. The sodium is low, the fiber is pretty high. If we even added in the ingredient list, you'll see the first ingredient is whole grain wheat. That's a good sign. That means there's more whole grain wheat in this cereal than any other options. But you'll see the second ingredient is dark chocolate bits. And that first ingredient in the dark chocolate bits is sugar. So something to be mindful of, but it's not necessarily end of the world. So let's take a closer look. So if we look at the serving size, so we say the serving size is 1 cup, that's that fistful, or that's this bowl size again, right? So that's maybe a reasonable serving for you, maybe not. So, but let's, for argument's sake, let's just use that as an example there. So typically when we see breakfast cereals that have less than 6 grams of sugar, but more than 4 grams of fiber for 1 cup serving, it's considered a reasonably, you know, balanced out amount. But I also want to consider sometimes we have to go beyond the label and say, consider this, is this a breakfast food for you? Is shredded wheat with chocolate, is chocolate a breakfast food for you? And some people might say, yes, absolutely. And some people might say, you know what, I think I prefer kind of the regular version of the shredded wheat where we're getting, you know, it's high fiber, low sodium, low sugar, but I prefer a plainer version. Or maybe, I don't know, you mix them, right? A little bit of the plain, a little bit of the chocolate if that's something that you enjoy doing. So definitely something to reconsider, isn't it? And so now that we've looked at the labels, I want you to feel more confident interpreting the information that you're going to see. It's not meant to confuse you, it's meant to help you make better decisions so when you're out there, you can feel more comfortable about looking at different foods and making better choices. And that's the important part of how to eat for a healthy heart. The last thing I want to end with is recognize that we have a lot of different components here that help us make better decisions. So we've got those nutrition facts tables, the claims that you'll see, we've got that % daily value to help us put it into context. We've got a lot of different options here, but there are some considerations I want you to think about when it comes to healthy eating. We eat way more than nutrients. Eating is complicated, it's complex. We don't just eat sodium minerals, right? We're eating all foods that are made up of complicated combinations of all of these nutrients. So nutritious food can reflect cultural preferences, or maybe it's favorite foods that you grew up with as a child, different food traditions for you, right? And so sometimes healthy eating doesn't look exactly like it does on a box or on a label. So having a little bit of flexibility there is important. We recognize eating with others is really important to feel connected. Food is social, right? When we meet up with friends, we don't just meet up and stand around. We often meet around a coffee or a lunch or a dinner. And so those are important things to remember when we're thinking about fostering generations of communication and food love and that kind of food literacy, right? Understanding what's healthy food and what's something we have often. And those are really important. Even when it's not meeting the label recommendations, it's okay, right? So these guys are here to help you make good decisions, but it doesn't have to be perfect every single day. Thanks, everyone.